The hammer slipped from my hand and clattered onto the weathered deck boards. Not because I was clumsy, but because of what Margaret Chen had just asked me. Standing there in her faded denim overalls, sawdust in her graying hair, she looked me straight in the eye and said those words that would change everything between us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't what you think it is. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in Rodriguez Construction's cramped office, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and wondering how much longer I could keep the lights on. The construction business has been brutal lately. Big companies were underbidding everyone, and homeowners were putting off renovations because of rising costs. My crew of 4 had dwindled to just me and Tommy, and even Tommy was talking about taking a job at his brother-in-law's plumbing company. The phone rang, cutting through my grim calculations. Rodriguez Construction, this is Jake. Hi, I got your number from Mrs. Patterson down on Elm Street. She said you did beautiful work on her kitchen cabinets last year. The voice was soft, hesitant. Female. I grabbed a pen. That's right. What can I help you with? Well, I have this deck. It's falling apart, honestly. The previous owners did some kind of DIY job that's turned into a safety hazard. I've gotten 3 quotes, and they're all way more than I can afford right now. Mrs. Patterson thought, maybe you might work with me on payment terms. I leaned back in my creaky office chair. Payment plans were risky, but I needed the work. What's your address? I can come take a look, give you a free estimate. 1247 Maple Grove Avenue. I'm Margaret Chen. Jake Rodriguez. I can be there tomorrow morning around 9 if that works. Perfect. Thank you so much. I hung up and made a note in my appointment book. Maple Grove Avenue was in the older part of town, where the houses had character, but often needed serious work. I'd driven through that neighborhood plenty of times, admiring the mature oak trees and wraparound porches that reminded me of my grandmother's house in San Antonio. The next morning, I loaded my truck with my basic tools and headed over. The house at 1247 was a 2-story craftsman with forest green shutters and a front yard that looked like something from a gardening magazine. Roses climbed a trellis by the front steps, and the lawn was perfectly maintained despite the early October heat we'd been having. I walked around to the back, where I found the deck in question. The woman on the phone hadn't been exaggerating. The structure was a disaster. Whoever had built it originally had used the wrong type of screws, hadn't properly sealed the wood, and had apparently never heard of building codes. Several of the support posts were rotting and the railings wobbled when I tested them. Pretty bad, isn't it? I turned to find a woman in her mid-40s watching me from the back door. She had shoulder-length black hair streaked with silver and wore a simple blue sweater and jeans. Her expression was a mix of embarrassment and hope. You must be Margaret. I'm Jake. We shook hands. Her grip was firm, confident. I inherited this house from my aunt 6 months ago, she explained, stepping carefully onto the deck. I didn't realize how bad this was until my neighbor's kid fell through one of these boards last week. Thankfully, he just got a scraped knee, but it scared me to death. I knelt down and examined the damaged board. The wood was soft with rot, and I could see carpenter ant damage in several of the joists underneath. Yeah, this needs to come down completely. The foundation might be salvageable, but everything above ground has to go. Margaret's face fell. How much are we talking about? I spent the next hour measuring and taking notes, checking the foundation, and assessing what materials we'd need. The job would require permits, which meant bringing everything up to current code. But the bones of the structure were solid, and the location was perfect for entertaining. Here's the thing, I said finally, sitting down at her kitchen table, with my calculator. This could be a really beautiful space. Your aunt picked a great spot for it, but you're looking at about $8,000 to do it right. Margaret stared at the number I'd written down. The other quotes were between $12,000 and $15,000. They were probably planning to rebuild the foundation too. I think we can save it. But I'll be honest with you. This isn't a job you want to cut corners on, not with safety issues. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the condemned deck. I just started teaching at the elementary school this year, she said finally. I moved here from Portland after my divorce was finalized. This house, it was supposed to be my fresh start, you know? But between the moving costs and getting settled, I don't have $8,000 sitting around. There was something in her voice that got to me. Maybe it was the way she said fresh start, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Or maybe it was the fact that she'd been honest about her situation instead of trying to negotiate. Me down. What if we did it in phases, I suggested. Tear down the dangerous parts first, make it safe, then rebuild in sections as you can afford it. Would that work? It's not ideal, but it's doable. We could start with $2,000 down, then $1,500 for each phase after that. Spread it out over 6 months. Margaret looked at me like I'd just offered her a winning lottery ticket. You'd really do that? Mrs. Patterson wasn't wrong about my work, I said, standing up. And I need the job. Fair trade. We shook hands again, and I felt a little spark of something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just relief at landing a contract, but genuine excitement about a project. The demolitions started the following Monday. Tommy showed up to help, grateful for the steady work, even if it meant dealing with rotted wood and angry carpenter ants. Margaret brought us coffee around 10, then disappeared inside to work on her lesson plans. Nice lady, Tommy commented, watching her through the kitchen window. Seems like it. Single? I gave him a look. Mind your own business. But I'd noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, and there were no signs of a man living in the house. Not that it mattered. I was there to fix her deck, not complicate her fresh start. The demo took 3 days. By Wednesday afternoon, we'd hauled away enough rotted lumber to fill 2 dumpsters. The foundation was in better shape than I'd hoped, needing only minor repairs in a couple of spots. It's amazing how much bigger the space looks now, Margaret said, stepping carefully around the exposed joists. Wait until we get the new decking down. You're going to have room for a whole outdoor dining set out here. She smiled, and I noticed she had a small gap between her front teeth that made her look younger. I've been dreaming about hosting dinner parties. My aunt used to have the whole neighborhood over for barbecues. What did she do? Your aunt. She was a librarian. Worked at the main branch downtown for 37 years. Never married. But she had more friends than anyone I've ever known. This house was always full of people. Margaret walked to the edge of the deck and looked out over the backyard. There was a mature apple tree in the corner, its branches heavy with fruit. She left me this place because she said I needed to learn how to put down roots. I'd moved 6 times in 10 years, following my ex-husband's job transfers. Never really had a chance to make friends or feel settled anywhere. And now? Now I'm terrified and excited in equal measure. I understood that feeling. I'd bought the construction business from my former boss 5 years ago, betting everything on being able to make it work. Some days I still wasn't sure if I'd made the right choice. The framework for the new deck went up quickly. By the end of the 2nd week, we had the basic structure in place and were ready to start on the decking boards. Margaret had chosen a composite material that would last decades without the maintenance issues of traditional wood. Smart choice, I told her as we unloaded the materials. This stuff costs more up front, but you'll never have to stain or seal it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My aunt always said to buy quality once instead of cheap twice. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. I was working alone. Tommy had a dentist appointment, cutting boards to fit around the support posts. Margaret had come outside to water her flower beds and ended up staying to watch me work. You make it look so easy, she said, settling into a lawn chair with a glass of iced tea. 23 years of practice. Started working construction when I was 19, right out of high school. Did you always want to be a contractor? I paused, considering how to answer. Most people didn't really want to hear the whole story. Actually, I wanted to be an architect. Had a scholarship to study. At UT Austin and everything. What happened? My dad got sick. Cancer. Someone needed to help support the family, and construction paid better than college loans. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Do you regret it? Some days. But I like working with my hands, and I'm good at solving problems. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it beautiful again. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. I taught high school English for 15 years, she said. Loved the kids, loved the books. But somewhere, along the way, I started feeling like I was just going through the motions, like I'd forgotten why I became a teacher in the first place. Is that why you switched to elementary school? Partly. And partly because after the divorce, I needed a complete change. New job, new town, new life. I set down my saw and looked at her. How's that working out so far? Ask me in 6 months. We worked in comfortable silence after that, her reading in the shade while I measured and cut and fitted the decking boards into place. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Usually, work sites were all noise and pressure and deadlines. But there was something about Margaret's backyard that felt different. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light filtered through the apple tree, or the sound of wind chimes from the neighbor's porch. Or maybe it was just having someone around who seemed genuinely interested in the process instead of just the end result. By Friday evening, we'd finished the main deck surface. Standing back to admire our work, I felt that familiar satisfaction of a job well done. It's beautiful, Margaret said, running her hand along the smooth railing. I can't believe this is the same space. Still need to add the stairs and finish the railings, but you could have people over now if you wanted. Actually, she hesitated, then seemed to make up her mind about something. I was thinking of grilling some burgers tomorrow evening. Nothing fancy. Would you and Tommy like to join me? Consider it a preview of those dinner parties I was talking about. I should have said no. It was unprofessional to socialize with clients, especially when the job wasn't finished. But something about the way she asked, hopeful but trying not to seem desperate, made it impossible to turn her down. Sure. What time? 6:30? I'll make some sides to go with the burgers. Tommy couldn't make it. His wife had family plans, so it ended up being just Margaret and me. She'd set up a small table on the new deck with a checkered tablecloth and citronella candles. The burgers were perfect, and she'd made potato salad and coleslaw that reminded me of church picnics from my childhood. This is nice, I said, looking around at the space we'd created together. Your aunt would have loved it. I hope so. I keep feeling like I'm not living up to her legacy somehow. She was so social, so confident. I'm still figuring out how to be the kind of person who hosts dinner parties. You're doing fine. This feels natural. Does it? Because I've been nervous about this all day. I haven't cooked for anyone but myself in months. I looked at her across the small table, candlelight flickering on her face, and realized something had shifted between us over the past 2 weeks. We weren't just contractors and clients anymore. We were becoming friends. Maybe more than friends. The thought scared me more than I wanted to admit. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather, which meant Tommy and I could finish the railings without worrying about rain delays. Margaret had returned to her teaching routine, but she'd started leaving us a thermos of coffee on the back steps each morning, along with homemade muffins or cookies. She's definitely into you, Tommy said Tuesday morning, biting into a blueberry muffin that was still warm from the oven. She's just being nice. Dude, my wife doesn't even bake for me anymore, and we've been married 12 years. This woman is sending signals. I ignored him and focused on installing the balusters. But the truth was, I'd been thinking about Margaret more than I should. The way she laughed at my terrible jokes, how she'd sit outside grading papers while we worked, occasionally asking questions about the construction process like she was genuinely interested. The fact that she remembered I liked my coffee black and always made sure the thermos was ready before we arrived. Wednesday afternoon she came home from school earlier than usual. I could hear her moving around inside the house, opening and closing cabinets, running water. The kitchen window was open, and the smell of something delicious drifted out. "Smells good in there," I called out during a break. Margaret appeared. At the back door, flower in her hair and an apron tied around her waist. "I'm experimenting with bread recipes. My aunt left behind about 50 cookbooks, and I'm trying to work my way through them. Want to be my taste tester?" An hour later, I was sitting at her kitchen table with a slice of honey wheat bread that was easily the best thing I'd eaten all month. Margaret sat across from me, nervously watching my reaction. "This is incredible," I said, reaching for a second slice. "You could sell this stuff?" "Really?" I was worried it was too dense. "Are you kidding? My grandmother would have killed for this recipe." Margaret beamed, and I realized how much her approval meant to her. It struck me that she'd been living alone, for months, with no one to cook for, no one to share small victories with. What else are you planning to make? Well, there's this apple cake recipe that uses fruit from the backyard tree, and something called Sunday chicken that looks amazing. But most of these recipes serve 6 to 8 people. Sounds like you need to start having those dinner parties sooner rather than later. She laughed, but there was something wistful in her expression. I keep telling myself I will, but then I chicken out. What if nobody comes? What if they come and have a terrible time? What if I burn the chicken? What if you don't try and spend the next year eating amazing food all by yourself? Margaret considered this, tearing off a piece of bread and chewing thoughtfully. You're right. I should just pick a date and invite people. Worst case scenario, I end up with leftovers for a week. Best case scenario, you make some new friends and start building that community your aunt had. Speaking of community, she said, there's a fall festival downtown this Saturday. Food trucks, live music, craft booths. I was thinking of going, but I don't really know anyone yet. Would you maybe want to come with me? As friends, she added quickly. I just thought it might be nice to have someone to walk around with. I should have made an excuse, should have kept things professional, but the hopeful look in her eyes made it impossible to say no. Sure, what time? Saturday turned out to be one of those perfect October days that make you remember why you love Texas. The festival was in full swing when we arrived, with families spread out on blankets and couples strolling hand in hand past the vendor booths. Margaret had dressed carefully, a soft yellow sweater and dark jeans that made her look younger than her 47 years. She'd let her hair down from its usual ponytail, and I caught myself noticing how the afternoon sunlight brought out the auburn highlights in the black. Where should we start? She asked, looking around at the options. Food first, shopping second. That's the proper festival strategy. We got barbecue from a truck called Smoky Joe's, and found a spot on the grass near the main stage where a bluegrass band was playing. Margaret closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun. I'd forgotten how much I love live music, she said. Portland had great venues, but my ex-husband always complained they were too loud or too crowded. What kind of music does he like? Jazz. But only the kind that sounds like mathematical equations. No soul, all theory. I laughed. Sounds like a fun guy. He's not a bad person, Margaret said carefully. We just wanted completely different things. He was focused on climbing the corporate ladder, moving to bigger cities, and making more money. I wanted a garden, a dog, and Sunday morning pancakes. What happened to the dog plan? That's actually next on my list. I've been looking at the animal shelter website, but I keep talking myself out of it. What if I pick the wrong one? What if I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility? You know what I think? I said, watching her face as she listened to the music. I think you've been asking permission for things for so long that you've forgotten how to just decide what you want and go for it. Margaret turned to look at me, something shifting in her expression. You might be right about that. We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through the festival. Margaret bought handmade soaps from a woman who knew her aunt, and I picked up a wooden cutting board that would make a good Christmas gift for my sister. We shared kettle corn and listened to a folk singer who reminded Margaret of someone she'd seen in college. It felt like a date, even though neither of us called it that. As the sun started to set, we walked back toward the parking area. Margaret was quiet, and I wondered if she was having the same thoughts I was, that this felt like more than friendship, and neither of us was quite sure what to do about it. Thank you for today, she said when we reached her car. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself this much. Me neither. We stood there for a moment, not quite ready to say goodbye. The air between us felt charged with possibility and uncertainty. Jake, Margaret started, then stopped herself. Never mind. I should let you get home. What were you going to say? She shook her head. It's nothing. I'll see you Monday morning. I'll be there. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been about to say something important, something that might have changed the careful balance we'd been maintaining between professional and personal. Monday morning brought a cold front and the first real hint of winter. Margaret's coffee thermos was waiting as usual, but she didn't come outside while we worked. I found myself glancing toward the kitchen window more often than I should have, wondering if I'd somehow crossed a line at the festival. The deck was nearly finished. Just a few trim pieces and the final coat of sealant on the railings. By Wednesday, we'd be done, and I'd have no reason to come back to 1247 Maple Grove Avenue. The thought bothered me more than it should have. Tuesday afternoon, Margaret finally appeared in the backyard. She was carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate and wearing a thick sweater against the unexpected chill. "Peace offering," she said, handing me one of the cups. "I've been hiding inside all week like a teenager with a crush." The admission hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable. Why hiding? Because I realized at the festival that I'm developing feelings for you, and I have no idea what to do about it. It's been so long since I've been attracted to someone that I'd forgotten what it felt like. And you're here working on my deck, being professional and kind, and I'm acting like I'm 15 years old. I set down my hammer and really looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold air and embarrassment, but her eyes were steady, waiting for my response. "Margaret, I know this complicates things," she said quickly. "And I know you probably think I'm some lonely divorcee who's reading too much into friendly conversation. But I needed to be honest about what I'm feeling, because pretending otherwise was making me crazy." The vulnerability in her voice undid me completely. This woman, who'd been so careful, so worried about making the wrong choices, was taking a risk on me. "You want to know the truth?" I said. "I've been looking forward to coming here every day, and not because of the deck. I like talking to you. I like the way you think about things. I like that you bake bread when you're nervous, and that you're brave enough to start over at 47. Relief flooded her face. "So I'm not imagining this?" "You're not imagining it." We stood there in her backyard, holding cups of hot chocolate, acknowledging something that had been building for weeks. The deck project was almost finished, but something else was just beginning. That evening, Margaret called and asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. Not grilled burgers on the deck this time, but a real meal inside her house. The invitation felt significant, like crossing into new territory. Her dining room was warm and inviting, with built-in cabinets that displayed her aunt's china collection and a table set for 2 with cloth napkins and wine glasses. She'd made the Sunday chicken, recipe from one of the cookbooks, and it filled the house with the smell of rosemary and garlic. "This is fancy," I said, looking around at the candles she'd lit. "I wanted to practice before I start having those dinner parties. Consider yourself my test audience." But we both knew this was more than practice. This was Margaret taking another step out of her comfort zone, and me accepting her invitation to be part of whatever she was building here. The chicken was perfect, paired with roasted vegetables from her garden and bread she'd made that morning. We talked about everything and nothing, my plans to expand the business, her students at school, books we'd both read, places we wanted to travel. "I've never been outside of Texas except for college," I admitted over dessert. "Always seemed like there was too much work to do here." "I lived in 8 different states with my ex-husband," Margaret said. "But I never really saw any of them. We'd move to a new city, find a house in the suburbs, and I'd spend 2 years trying to make friends before we'd move again. I became an expert at packing boxes, not at exploring places." "What would you want to see now, if you could go anywhere?" Her eyes lit up. "Italy, specifically Tuscany. I want to take a cooking class in some little village and learn to make pasta from someone's grandmother. I want to drink wine in the afternoon and not feel guilty about it." "That sounds perfect for you. What about you? Where would you go?" I thought about it. "Japan, maybe. I'd love to see their traditional carpentry techniques, the way they join. Wood without nails or screws, just precise cuts and perfect craftsmanship." "We should make a pact," Margaret said, refilling our wine glasses. "In 5 years, we both take our dream trips. No excuses, no putting it off for practical reasons. Deal." We shook hands across the table, but this time her fingers lingered in mine a moment longer than necessary. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Margaret had built a fire in the fireplace, and the room glowed with warm light. We sat on opposite ends of her couch, talking and laughing until well past midnight. "I should probably head home," I said finally, though I didn't want to leave. "Probably," she agreed, but made no move to get up. The space between us on the couch felt charged with possibility. I could have moved closer, could have kissed her. The moment was there, waiting. But something held me back. Maybe respect for the careful pace we'd been maintaining, or maybe fear of rushing something that felt too important to mess up. Instead, I stood and gathered my jacket. Thank you for dinner. For all of this. Margaret walked me to the front door, and we stood there in the porch light like teenagers after a first date. Jake, she said softly. I'm glad you said yes to fixing my deck. Best job I've ever taken. The next morning was our last day of work on the project. Tommy arrived early, eager to finish up so he could start a bathroom renovation across town. The final details went quickly, touching up paint, installing the last pieces of trim, cleaning up our tools and equipment. By noon, the deck was complete. 22 days after we'd started demolition, Margaret had a beautiful outdoor space that would last for decades. But as I packed up my truck, I felt an unexpected sadness. This project had given me a reason to see Margaret every day, and now that reason is gone. She came outside to inspect our work, running her hands along the smooth railings and testing the stairs we'd built down to the garden level. It's absolutely perfect, she said. Better than I ever imagined. Your aunt would have loved it. She would have loved you, Margaret said, then blushed at her own boldness. Tommy cleared his throat. I'm going to load the last of the tools, he said diplomatically, giving us some privacy. Margaret and I stood in the middle of her new deck, surrounded by the work we'd created together. The October afternoon was clear and bright, with just enough breeze to make the apple tree rustle. So what happens now? She asked. It was the question I'd been dreading. In the normal course of business, I'd give her my final invoice, she'd write a check, and we'd shake hands goodbye. Maybe she'd recommend me to friends if they needed construction work. Maybe I'd drive by occasionally and see her deck aging gracefully in her backyard. But nothing about this felt normal. I don't know, I admitted. I've never been in this situation. Before. What situation? Falling for a client. The words came out before I could stop them, raw and honest. Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't step away. Is that what's happening here? Yeah. I think it is. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out over her backyard. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. I moved here to start over. To figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs me to be. And for the first time in years, I feel like myself around someone. Around me? Around you. The admission hung between us, vulnerable and true. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance between us, but something in her posture told me to wait. I'm scared, Jake, she said finally. It's been 2 years since my divorce was finalized, but I feel like I'm just now ready to think about being with someone again. And the idea of messing this up, of losing what we have. We don't have to rush anything, I said. We can take this as slow as you need. What if slow turns into never? What if I'm too damaged from my marriage to ever really trust someone? Again. The pain in her voice broke my heart. I could see the war happening inside her. The desire to move forward, fighting against years of disappointment and broken promises. Margaret, look at me. She turned, and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. You rebuild your entire life. You moved to a new state, started a new job, bought a house, and turned it into a home. You're not damaged. You're brave. I don't feel brave. The bravest people never do. She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. Will you come to dinner Friday night? Not as my contractor, not as a test run for entertaining. As someone I care about who I want to spend time with. Yes. Even though I'm terrified and might spend the whole week second-guessing myself? Especially then. Tommy honked the horn of his truck, signaling that he was ready to go. The spell of the moment broke, and we both laughed. I should let you get back to work, Margaret said. I'll see you Friday. What time? 7? I'll be here. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of Margaret in my side mirror, standing on her new deck with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small but determined, like someone preparing to take a leap she wasn't sure she was ready for. Friday couldn't come fast enough. Friday afternoon, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, standing in front of my bedroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear to dinner. It wasn't a construction site or a business meeting. It was a date with a woman who made me want to be better than I was. I settled on dark jeans and a button-down shirt my sister had given me for Christmas, one I'd never worn because it seemed too nice for my usual activities. But tonight felt like an occasion worth dressing up for. I stopped at the florist on 7th Street and spent 20 minutes debating between roses and something less traditional. The elderly woman behind the counter watched my internal struggle with amusement. "First, date?" she asked, something like that. "These," she said, pointing to a bouquet of sunflowers mixed with orange chrysanthemums. "They're cheerful without being too serious. Says you put thought into it without making promises you're not ready to keep." Perfect. I arrived at Margaret's house exactly at 7, bouquet in hand and more nervous than I'd been since high school. She answered the door wearing a burgundy dress that brought out the warm tones in her hair, and I temporarily forgot how to speak. "You look beautiful," I managed finally. "Thank you." "These are gorgeous," she said, accepting the flowers. "Sunflowers are my favorite." "How did you know?" I hadn't known, but I wasn't about to admit that. Lucky guess. She led me inside, and I immediately smelled something incredible coming from the kitchen. The dining room table was set with the same care as before, but tonight felt different, more intentional, more like the beginning of something rather than an experiment. "Wine?" she offered, already pouring from a bottle she'd opened to breathe. "Please." She handed me a glass, and our fingers brushed in the exchange. The simple contact sent electricity up my arm. "I should check on dinner," she said, retreating to the kitchen. I followed, watching her move around the space with practiced efficiency. She'd made beef bourguignon, a dish that required hours of preparation. The fact that she'd invested that much time tonight made my chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to love. "Smells incredible. How long have you been cooking?" "Since about noon," she admitted, checking the oven. "I may have gone a little overboard, but I wanted tonight to be special. It already is." She turned to face me, wine glass in hand, and I saw the same nervous energy I was feeling reflected in her eyes. "Jake, before we sit down, I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. "Okay. I called my sister yesterday, told her about you, about what's been happening, and she said something that I can't stop thinking about." I waited, not sure I wanted to hear what Margaret's sister had said. She said that when she met her husband, she knew within a month that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Not because it was logical or practical, but because being with him felt like coming home after a long trip. Margaret took a sip of wine, gathering courage for whatever came next. "I've been thinking about that, about what home feels like. And I realized that these past few weeks, watching you work on my deck, having you here in my space, it's the first time since I was a child that I've felt truly at home somewhere." The words hit me like a physical force. I set down my wine glass because my hands were starting to shake. "Margaret, I'm not saying I'm ready to make any big declarations," she continued quickly. "I'm just saying that whatever this is between us, it feels important, real, and I don't want to let fear keep me from exploring it." I stepped closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "What are you afraid of? Getting hurt again, hurting you, making the wrong choice and ending up more alone than I was before?" "And what if you make the right choice?" She smiled, soft and hopeful. "Then maybe I get to find out what it feels like to be truly happy." The space between us disappeared. I reached up to touch her face, tracing the line of her cheekbone with my thumb. She leaned into the contact, eyes fluttering closed. "Can I kiss you?" I asked. I was hoping you would. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when she responded, her hands fisting in my shirt to pull me closer, it deepened into something that made my knees weak. She tasted like wine and possibility, and when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. "The timer," she whispered against my lips. "What?" "The oven timer. It's been going off for 30 seconds. We laughed, the tension breaking into something warm and natural. Margaret rescued dinner while I tried to collect myself, still feeling the imprint of her mouth on mine. Over beef bourguignon and candlelight, we talked about things we'd never shared with anyone. Margaret told me about the loneliness of her marriage, how she'd felt invisible for years. I told her about the dreams I'd given up and the regrets that sometimes kept me awake at night. "Do you ever think about going back to school?" she asked. "Studying architecture like you originally planned?" "Sometimes. But I'm 41 years old. By the time I finished, I'd be close to 50. "So? You're going to be close to 50 anyway. Might as well be close to 50 with an architecture degree." I laughed, but the idea sparked something in my chest. "You make it sound simple. Maybe it is simple, and we just make it complicated." I spent 15 years teaching high school because it was what I'd always done, even after I stopped loving it. It took a divorce and a cross-country move for me to remember that I actually preferred working with younger kids. Now I love going to work again. What changed? I stopped asking permission to want things. After dinner, we moved to the living room again, but this time I sat next to her on the couch instead of maintaining careful distance. She curled up against my side, her head on my shoulder, and we watched the fire crackle in the fireplace. "This is nice," she murmured. "Yeah, it is. Jake? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I tensed slightly. "Okay," she lifted her head to look at me. "Do you think 47 is too old to fall in love again? Really fall in love, not just companionship or settling for good enough?" The question caught me off guard, but the answer came immediately. No. I think 47 is exactly the right age to fall in love. Old enough to know what you want, young enough to enjoy it when you find it. Even if the person has baggage, even if they're scared and cautious and maybe a little damaged. "Especially then," I said, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Because at 47, you know that perfect doesn't exist, but real does, and honesty does, and brave enough to try again." Tears gathered in her eyes, but they looked like relief rather than sadness. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. "I know I'm falling in love with you." This time when we kissed, it felt like a promise. Like the beginning of something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us desperately needed. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, we were warm and safe, and finally home. That night changed everything between us. I didn't go home until almost midnight, and when I finally did leave, it was with the promise to come back for breakfast. Not because Margaret needed her deck fixed, or because we had business to discuss, but because we both wanted to wake up knowing we'd see each other again. Saturday morning, I arrived to find her in the kitchen wearing an oversized sweater and making pancakes from scratch. Her hair was still messy from sleep, and she had flour on her nose. She looked more beautiful than she had the night before in her burgundy dress. "Good morning," she said, turning to smile at me with a spatula in her hand. "Good morning." The greeting felt significant somehow, like we were acknowledging that this was our first morning as something more than friends. I kissed her cheek, breathing in the scent of vanilla and coffee that seemed to follow her everywhere. "How'd you sleep?" I asked. "Better than I have in months." "You?" "Same." We ate breakfast on the deck we'd built together, wrapped in blankets, against the morning chill. The autumn light filtered through the apple tree, and I could hear Margaret's neighbors starting their weekend routines in adjacent yards. "I have a confession," Margaret said, cutting into her pancakes. "I've been thinking about this deck as more than just a home improvement project." "What do you mean?" "When I inherited this house, it felt like my aunt was giving me permission to build the life I'd always wanted, but never had the courage to pursue. The deck was supposed to be the first step, creating a space where I could entertain, where I could be the kind of person who hosts dinner parties and brings people together." She paused, looking out over the space we'd created. But now I realized the deck was never really about the parties. It was about being brave enough to invite someone into my world. "And did it work?" She looked at me with eyes that sparkled with mischief. "I'd say the plan exceeded expectations." That afternoon, Margaret suggested we go to the animal shelter. She'd been talking about getting a dog for weeks, and our conversation about stopping asking permission had apparently given her the push she needed. "What kind of dog are you thinking?" I asked as we walked through the kennels. "I honestly have no idea. Something medium-sized? Good with kids since I'm a teacher? Beyond that, I figured I'd know when I saw the right one." We walked past dozens of dogs, Puppies tumbling over each other, senior dogs sleeping peacefully, energetic breeds bouncing off kennel walls. Margaret stopped in front of each one, reading their information cards and asking the volunteer questions about their personalities. Then we turned a corner and found him. He was a chocolate lab mix, maybe 3 years old, sitting calmly in his kennel while chaos erupted around him. His tag said his name was Buster, and he'd been surrendered when his family moved and couldn't take him along. "Hi there, handsome," Margaret said softly, crouching down to his level. Buster approached the front of the kennel, tail wagging slowly. When Margaret extended her fingers through the chain link, he gently licked them. "Can we take him to the meet and greet room?" she asked the volunteer. 20 minutes later, we were sitting on the floor of a small room while Buster explored, occasionally returning to Margaret for pets and treats. He was calm, well-mannered, and seemed to have an intuitive sense about people's energy. "He's perfect," Margaret said, scratching behind his ears. "But am I ready for this? What if I mess it up?" "Look at him," I said, watching Buster settle his head in Margaret's lap. "He's already decided you're his person. Sometimes the choice gets made for us." That evening, Margaret signed the adoption papers. By Sunday afternoon, Buster was settled in his new home, sleeping on a dog bed in the living room like he'd always belonged there. "I can't believe I have a dog," Margaret said, watching him through the kitchen window as he explored the backyard. "Yesterday, I was a single teacher with a new deck. Today, I'm a single teacher with a new deck and a chocolate lab. Tomorrow, you'll be a single teacher with a new deck, a chocolate lab, and a boyfriend." The word slipped out before I could stop it. We'd confessed our feelings, we'd kissed, we'd spent the weekend together, but we hadn't officially defined what we were doing. Margaret turned from the window, eyebrows raised. "Boyfriend? If you want. If it's not too fast or too presumptuous or—" She kissed me, cutting off my nervous rambling. "I want," she said against my lips. "I definitely want to." The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt natural and right. I'd stop by after work most evenings, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just sitting on the deck with Margaret and Buster, talking about our days. Weekends were spent exploring the town together. Farmers markets, local festivals, hiking trails neither of us had known existed. Margaret threw her first dinner party in November, inviting 3 other teachers from school and their spouses. She was nervous for days beforehand, planning the menu and second-guessing every detail. What if the conversation dies? What if the food is terrible? What if they think I'm trying too hard? "Then you'll order pizza and laugh about it," I told her. "The point isn't perfection, it's a connection." The party was a success. Margaret's guests loved the food, the conversation flowed easily, and by the end of the evening, plans were being made for a holiday potluck at someone else's house. "I can't believe I was so scared of this," Margaret said as we cleaned up afterwards. "It was actually fun. Your aunt would be proud." "You think so?" "I know so. You're becoming exactly who she hoped you'd become." December brought the first freeze, and the kind of cold that made you grateful for fireplaces and warm kitchens. Margaret's house became our unofficial headquarters, the place where we'd meet after work and on weekends. I kept a spare change of clothes in her closet and a toothbrush in her bathroom. Buster had claimed me as part of his pack, following me around the yard while I did small maintenance projects. It felt like playing house, except it wasn't playing. It was building something real. One evening in mid-December, Margaret and I were sitting by the fire with Buster sprawled between us, planning our Christmas decorations for the deck. "I want to string lights along all the railings," she said, sketching ideas on a piece of paper. "And maybe get some of those big outdoor ornaments for the apple tree. We could build a small table out there for hot chocolate service. Nothing fancy, just something weatherproof for mugs and thermoses." She repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." Margaret set down her pen and turned to face me fully. "Jake, can I tell you something?" "Always." When I moved here, I thought starting over meant leaving everything behind and reinventing myself from scratch. But that's not what happened at all. What happened instead? I found out who I was when I stopped trying to be what other people needed me to be. And then I found someone who loves that person exactly as she is. Flaws and all? Especially the flaws. She curled up against my side, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the weight of contentment settle over us like a blanket. So, I said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, still think 47 is too old to fall in love? Margaret laughed, the sound rich and happy in the quiet room. I think 47 is exactly the right age to fall in love. Old enough to know it's precious, young enough to enjoy every minute of it. Outside, snow began to fall on the deck we'd built together, covering it in a blanket of white that made everything look new and full of possibility. Inside, we sat by the fire with our dog, planning our future one conversation at a time. It turned out that fixing her deck had been about so much more than wood and nails and building codes. It had been about building a foundation strong enough to support whatever came next, and what came next was everything we'd been hoping for without daring to ask. The snow that had started falling that December evening turned into the heaviest winter storm Texas had seen in years. By morning, Margaret's deck was buried under 6 inches of white, and the city had essentially shut down. Schools were closed, construction sites were abandoned, and most people were hunkered down at home waiting for the roads to clear. I'd stayed over at Margaret's, partly because of the weather and partly because leaving her warm house for my empty apartment had started feeling wrong. We spent the snow day like kids, making hot chocolate, watching old movies, and taking Buster out to experience his first real snowfall. Look at him, Margaret laughed, pointing to where Buster was bounding through the snow like a puppy. He's having the time of his life. Smart dog. He knows a good thing when he sees it. We were standing at her kitchen window, watching our dog play in the backyard that had become as much mine as hers over the past month. The possessive thought, our dog, our backyard, should have scared me. Instead, it felt natural. Jake, Margaret said softly, we need to talk about something. My stomach clenched. In my experience, conversations that started with those words rarely went well. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. But I got a call yesterday that I need to tell you about. She led me to the kitchen table, and we sat down with our mugs of hot chocolate. Margaret's expression was serious but not upset, which helped calm my nerves slightly. Remember when I told you about my ex-husband's job transfers? How? We moved every couple of years? I nodded. Well, his company offered him a position in Houston. Executive level, big promotion, significant raise, and yesterday, he called to ask if I wanted to get back together. The words hit me like a physical blow. I set down my mug because my hands had started shaking. What did you tell him? I told him no, obviously. But Jake, the conversation made me realize something important. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. For 15 years, I followed someone else's dreams. I packed up my life every time he got a new opportunity, convinced myself that supporting his career was the same as building our future together. But it wasn't. I was just disappearing piece by piece. Margaret, let me finish. When he called yesterday, asking me to give up my job and my house and my new life to follow him again, I felt nothing. No temptation, no second thoughts, no wondering what if. All I could think about was how much I love the life I've built here. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by something that felt like panic. So you're staying? I'm staying, but that's not what we need to talk about. I waited. Not sure I wanted to hear what came next. The conversation with my ex made me realize that I never want to be in a relationship again, where one person's dreams matter more than the other's. I never want to be the one who always compromises. But I also never want to be the one who expects someone else to give up their goals for mine. Okay, I said carefully. What does that mean for us? Margaret squeezed my hands. It means I need to know what your dreams are. Real dreams, not just what you think you should want. Because if we're going to build something together, it has to be something we both want. The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years focused on just keeping my business afloat that I'd stopped thinking about what I actually wanted, beyond survival. I don't know, I admitted. It's been so long since anyone asked me that. Then we have time to figure it out. Together. That afternoon, while the snow continued to fall, we talked about things I'd never shared with anyone. Margaret told me about the novel she'd started writing in college but never finished. I told her about the house I'd always wanted to design and build from scratch. She talked about her dream of taking cooking classes in Italy. I mentioned my interest in historical restoration projects. "What's stopping you from finishing your novel?" I asked. "Fear, mostly. What if it's terrible? What if I'm not as good a writer as I thought I was in college? What if you are? What's stopping you from going back to school for architecture?" she countered. "Money, time, age, all the usual excuses." What if those are just excuses? We challenged each other that day in ways that felt both uncomfortable and exhilarating. Margaret had a talent for asking questions that forced me to examine assumptions I'd been carrying for years. By evening, we'd made a pact. Margaret would commit to writing for at least an hour every morning before school. I would research architecture programs and figure out what it would actually take to go back to school. "What if we both fail spectacularly?" Margaret asked as we cleaned up dinner dishes. "Then we'll fail together. And at least we'll know we tried." Spring brought a series of changes that tested our commitment to supporting each other's dreams. Margaret had been writing every morning for 3 months and had completed the first draft of a young adult novel about a girl who inherits her grandmother's house and discovers a hidden room full of family secrets. It wasn't perfect, but it was finished, and she was glowing with the accomplishment. Meanwhile, I'd been accepted into a part-time architecture program at the local community college. The classes were scheduled for evenings and weekends, which meant I could keep my construction business running while I studied, but it also meant long days and less time for the easy rhythm Margaret and I had established. "Are you sure about this?" I asked her one evening as I packed my textbooks for a night class. "It's going to be crazy for the next few years." "I'm sure," she said, kissing me goodbye. "Besides, I'll be busy revising my novel and figuring out how to find an agent. We'll be crazy together." The first semester nearly broke me. Between running jobs during the day and studying at night, I was exhausted, constantly. There were evenings when I fell asleep over my drafting homework at Margaret's kitchen table, and mornings when I was too tired to appreciate the breakfast she'd made. But Margaret never complained. She brought me coffee during late-night study sessions, helped me practice presentations, and celebrated every small victory like it was a major triumph. "You got an A on your structural engineering exam," she announced one evening, waving my graded test like a victory flag. "This calls for a celebration dinner." "Margaret, it's just one test." "It's not just one test. It's proof that you can do this. That you're exactly as smart and capable as I always knew you were." Her faith in me was unwavering, even when my own confidence faltered. And when her novel was rejected by the first 3 literary agents she queried, I tried to return the favor. "This doesn't mean your book isn't good," I told her as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at another rejection email. "It just means you haven't found the right person yet." What if there is no right person? What if I'm deluding myself about having any talent? Then you'll write another book. And another one after that. Because the woman I know doesn't give up on things that matter to her. By the end of my second semester, we'd found our new rhythm. Margaret's novel had been picked up by an agent who loved the premise and had several publishers interested. My grades were solid, and I'd discovered a passion for sustainable design that was already influencing my construction projects. One evening, in late May, we were sitting on our deck, the deck that had brought us together, watching Buster chase fireflies in the backyard. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if your deck hadn't needed fixing?" I asked. Margaret considered the question. "I think we would have found each other anyway. Maybe not as quickly, but eventually." "What makes you so sure?" "Because some things are meant to be. And when you're ready for love, really ready, not just lonely or scared of being alone, it has a way of finding you." She was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Besides, I'm pretty sure the universe has a sense of humor." I spent months asking if 47 was too old to fall in love again, and then it sent me to a man who literally built me a foundation for the rest of my life. Pretty good metaphor. Pretty good man. As the fireflies danced around us and the evening settled into comfortable quiet, I realized that Margaret had been right about something else too. Building a life with someone wasn't about finding a perfect person or becoming perfect yourself. It was about finding someone who believed in your dreams enough to help you build them, one careful piece at a time. 2 years after I'd first knocked on Margaret's door with a toolbox and a desperate need for work, I found myself standing in the same backyard, but everything had changed. The deck we'd built together had weathered 2 winters and countless dinner parties. The apple tree was heavy with fruit again, and Margaret's garden had expanded to include a vegetable patch that kept us in tomatoes and herbs all summer. But the biggest change wasn't visible in the landscape. It was in us. I'd just finished my final architecture exam of the semester when Margaret burst through the back door, waving her phone and practically vibrating with excitement. "Jake! Jake! You're not going to believe this!" I looked up from where I was sketching preliminary designs for a client's addition, a project that would be my first as a licensed architect-contractor hybrid, combining my old skills with my new education. "What happened?" "My book!" My agent just called. "Hartwell Publishing wants to buy it, and they're talking about a 3-book deal." I dropped my pencil and swept her into a hug, spinning her around on the deck we'd built with our own hands. Buster barked excitedly from his spot in the shade. Not sure what the celebration was about, but eager to participate. "Margaret, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you." She was crying and laughing at the same time, her face pressed against my shoulder. "I can't believe it's really happening. 3 years ago, I didn't even think I was brave enough to start writing again. And now you're going to be a published author." We held each other in the afternoon sunlight, and I thought about all the things that had led us to this moment. Margaret's courage to start over. My decision to take her payment plan offer. The thousands of small choices that had built our relationship. One conversation, one shared meal, one quiet evening at a time. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling back to look at me. "The money from the book deal. It's enough for me to take a sabbatical from teaching. I could write full-time for a year. That sounds perfect. But it would mean being home more, a lot more. And I know you're busy with school and the business, and I don't want to be in your way." I silenced her with a kiss. "Margaret Chen, you could never be in my way. This is your house, your dream, your moment. I'm just lucky I get to be here for it." That evening, we celebrated with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of champagne Margaret had been saving for a special occasion. We ate on the deck, feet propped up on the railings, talking about what the next year would look like. "I'll need to set up a proper writing space," Margaret said, already planning. "Maybe convert the spare bedroom into an office. I could build you a desk. Something custom, with exactly the right height and storage for your needs. You'd do that?" "Of course. I'm pretty handy with construction projects." She laughed, remembering that first phone call when she'd asked if I could work with her on payment terms. Best investment I ever made. The deck? The contractor. As summer turned to fall, we settled into a new routine. Margaret wrote in the mornings, the sound of her keyboard clicking away in her new office, while I reviewed blueprints or worked on smaller projects. Afternoons, we'd often end up working in the same space, her at her desk, me at the kitchen table with my architecture homework spread out. It should have felt cramped or distracting, but instead it felt like partnership. We were both building something, both working toward dreams we'd thought were impossible just a few years earlier. One October afternoon, almost exactly 3 years after we'd first met, I was installing new shelves in Margaret's office when she stopped typing and turned to watch me work. "What?" I asked, noticing her stare. "Nothing. I just like watching you build things. You get this look of complete concentration, like nothing else in the world exists. It's the same look you get when you're writing, like you're somewhere else entirely. I am somewhere else. That's the magic of it." I finished attaching the shelf bracket and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you remember that night when you asked me if 47 was too old to fall in love again?" She smiled. "Of course. It was the night everything changed between us." "What would you say now? Looking back, was it too old?" Margaret saved her work and swiveled her chair to face me completely. "You know what I've learned? Age isn't about the number of years you've been alive. It's about how open you are to new experiences, how willing you are to be vulnerable, how much courage you have left for building something beautiful." She stood up and crossed the small office to where I was standing. At 47, I had enough experience to recognize something real when I found it, but I was still young enough to take risks on it. I was old enough to know my own mind, but young enough to change it when I found something better than what I'd planned. And now? At 50? Now I know that love isn't something you age out of. It's something you grow into. Every year, every experience, every mistake and triumph and quiet moment, it all makes you more capable of loving deeply. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box I'd been carrying around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. In that case, I said, dropping to one knee right there in her writing office, surrounded by books and papers and the desk I'd built with my own hands. "Margaret Chen, will you marry me?" Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide with surprise and joy. "Jake, I know we said we didn't need a piece of paper to prove our commitment, and I know you've already been married once and maybe don't need to do it again. But I want everyone to know that you're my person, and I'm yours. I want to build a life with you officially, legally, completely." I opened the box to reveal a simple, solitaire diamond in a vintage setting I'd found at an estate sale. It wasn't the biggest or most expensive ring, but it had character and history, like the house we'd turned into a home. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes. It's absolutely a yes." She pulled me to my feet and kissed me, and I slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that were shaking slightly. It fit perfectly, like it had been meant for her all along. "I love you, Margaret. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." That evening, we called our families and friends to share the news. Margaret's sister screamed so loudly over the phone that Buster barked in concern. My mother cried happy tears and immediately started planning a trip to meet her future daughter-in-law. Tommy texted back with 3 exclamation points and an offer to help with whatever construction projects the wedding might require. We decided on a small ceremony in the backyard, on the deck that had brought us together. Just close family and friends, simple flowers from Margaret's garden, and a reception under the apple tree that had witnessed our entire relationship unfold. "It's perfect," Margaret said as we stood on the deck planning the layout. "This space has been the heart of everything good that's happened between us." "Any regrets?" I asked. "About waiting until 50 to get married again?" Margaret looked around at the life we'd built together. The house that had become ours, the dog sleeping contentedly in his favorite spot, the vegetable garden we tended. Together, the office where she wrote stories that were about to be published around the world. My only regret is that I wasted so many years being afraid to ask for what I wanted. But maybe I needed those years to become the person who was ready for this. She leaned against the railing I'd installed with my own hands and smiled at me with complete contentment. Besides, some things are worth waiting for, and some foundations take time to build properly. 6 months later, on a warm spring day surrounded by everyone we loved, Margaret and I exchanged vows on the deck we'd built together. As we kissed for the first time as husband and wife, I caught a glimpse of the future. Decades of shared meals, quiet evenings, challenges faced together, dreams built side by side. It had started with a simple question about whether 47 was too old to fall in love again. The answer, it turned out, was beautifully simple. You're never too old to build something worth having, especially when you find someone willing to hand you the tools. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.